Hey guys, tonight we'll step behind the curtain of history to reveal a truth that's stranger than any fiction. The world still remembers Elizabeth I as the Virgin Queen, a symbol of power and purity. But what if that perfect image hid a gruesome reality? What if the Queen's own body was a source of decay, a silent poison that seeped into the very heart of her empire? This wasn't a curse from a rival kingdom or a betrayal from within her court. It was a slow, horrifying rot born from habits no one dared to question, turning the magnificent royal palace into a breeding ground for sickness and death. Courtiers fell ill with mysterious ailments, and servants vanished without a trace, all while a hidden contagion spread through the silk gowns and powdered wigs of the monarchy. Tonight, we're going somewhere history books rarely dare to go. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I'm always fascinated to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Disgusting hygiene habit number 1. The Queen's scalp and the disease. Spreading comb. A close inspection of Elizabeth I's scalp reveals sheer horror. The chalk-white face powder laced with mercury had dried and cracked into large flakes, peeling away like crumbling lime and exposing festering scars that oozed thick pus. She almost never touched water. How could a virgin queen allow a mere breeze to tarnish her reputation? No. She chose instead to lay a lid on her lips and eyelids, then pile more mercury onto her skin, poisonous substances eating into every layer of her epidermis, shredding healthy cells into tiny fragments. Thus, the Queen's scalp became a smouldering hotbed of infection, day by day growing more inflamed, flaking away in clumps, and coated in oil and grime that no amount of wiping could remove. Beneath that rotted surface lay her magnificent wigs. Her real hair was hidden away, but the fake hair was hardly sanitary. The women closest to her, ladies-in-waiting and court attendants, had to handle, lift, and adjust those heavy powder-scented wigs every single day. They gripped hard wooden combs, whose teeth were caked in lead powder, flakes of dead skin, dried blood, and fresh pus. A single brush sent particles, bacteria, and parasites flying in all directions, releasing candida spores, lice, and golden staphylococci that lurked between the strands. The attendant beside her would inhale those toxic particles, then run a hand through her own hair, and unwittingly carry the infection along. Over time, they would break out in itching rashes, red blotches spreading across their scalp, and hair falling out in patches onto the dusty velvet floor. When the sores worsened and began to weep pus, they were carted off to the infirmary. The royal physicians, powerless to recognize bacteria, treated them by slathering herbal poultices and sprinkling yet more mercury to draw out the poison, a remedy that only deepened the wounds and intensified the foul, acrid stench, scaring away even the hardiest of servants. Those wooden combs, declared private royal possessions, were never discarded. After each use, they were simply wiped with a soft cloth and placed in an ornately carved wooden box, its lid snapped shut. That box became a tiny coffin for disease. Moisture from pus and oil accumulated within, where bacteria thrived month after month. Then another lady-in-waiting would open the box, dust off the grimy comb, and resume brushing the Queen's hair. Thus formed a closed loop of contagion. Queen's scalp wooden comb, servant's scalp comb, again spreading throughout the palace. The sores did not confine themselves to the scalp, but crept down to the servants' necks, shoulders, and upper backs. The palace, lacking any system of sterilization, reeked of sweat, cosmetic powder, and festering infections. Corridors once lavishly gilded and thickly carpeted, once dazzling bred bacteria in every thread. As fungal spores drifted through curtain pleats and settled on banisters, burning the skin of any passerby brave enough to touch them. The act of combing hair, once deemed high ceremony, was in truth a daily ritual of death. Every servant knew the perils but dared not refuse. They bit their lips, bowed their heads, and endured their role as nothing more than expendable instruments. Their trembling hands lifted the long silk train of their gowns to maintain decorum, even as guilt and terror burned their souls like the comb's rusty teeth had burned their scalps. Each footstep on the velvet corridors seemed to whisper, This is the price of power. Ham. Meanwhile, the queen stood unperturbed, her marble-white visage flawless, smiling as though in blissful ignorance. She surveyed her dressing table and the porcelain pot containing those deadly combs and cosmetics, never once letting a drop of water wash away the toxic residue. The palace, meant as a sanctuary, had instead become a vast chamber of infection, threatening not only the humblest servant, but also the highest-ranking courtiers and visiting dignitaries. The first signs of the mini-pandemic emerged in the kitchen, where servants, shivering with fever, collapsed as they tried to deliver meals. In the infirmary, victims lay shoulder to shoulder on rickety straw beds, gasping for breath, their hands gleaming with pus, their terrified eyes flicking toward one another. Some died quietly in the dead of night, leaving only the soft rustle of sheets and that unmistakable stench clinging to their pillows. Every sterilization amounted to no more than scattering fragrant flower petals or hanging bunches of herbs over doorways in a desperate attempt to mask the odor. But the festering sores and decaying flesh could not be hidden. The palace was divided into clean quarters, thickly powdered in chalk, and contaminated chambers locked tight. Yet germs paid no heed to doors. They seeped into the wood, crept through cracks, and found their way to the dressing tables, the combs, and the very garments of anyone who dared approach the queen. Thus, this disgusting first hygiene habit, the queen's infected scalp, and the disease-spreading comb became the grim prologue to the queen's rot, a small yet terrifying epidemic haunting the gilded halls and ancient wood, an avoidable tragedy, born of vanity and ignorance. By the time the moon rose high, you could still smell it. The decay of skin, the dust of lead powder, the tang of festering pus, clinging to every breath in the cold, silent air. Disgusting hygiene habit number 2. The queen's perfumed gowns and the filth within. If you thought the tragedy was limited to her scalp, imagine now the vast wardrobes of Elizabeth I. Rows upon rows of heavy silk gowns, each layered with countless petticoats, ruffles, and stiff underskirts. Habit number 2 reveals that these opulent garments, pressed and puffed to perfection, were never truly clean. Instead, they were dusted with sweet-smelling powders and lavishly perfumed to mask odors so foul that even the bravest guest would blanch. A closer look at a single gown uncovers a nightmare. Months, even years, of sweat, body oils, menstrual fluids, and unwashed secretions pressed into the very weave of the fabric. These silken layers, prized as symbols of royal status, had become dark repositories of bacteria, mold, and parasites. The queen's maids, ladies in waiting appointed to dress her each day, would gingerly lift the hems, adjust the corsets, and lace each bodice. Each tug, each shift of the waistband, picked up microscopic colonies living deep in the threads. These court attendants had to don perfumed gloves and dip large cotton swabs into bowls of rosewater and musk, firmly believing that the sweet scent would override any underlying stench. Yet the perfumes did nothing to kill the microbes festering within. Instead, they formed a sticky barrier that trapped sweat and skin flakes against the silk. Every time the queen moved, tiny clouds of dust and bacteria were dislodged, drifting down onto the marble floors or into the faces of those who knelt too close. The first victims of these perfumed prisons were the maids whose hands became raw from constant adjusting and lacing. Their fingers slid beneath layers of fabric coated in sweat and powdered fragrances, until cracks formed in the delicate skin. Soon red welts appeared where the gloves never touched around wrists, across knuckles, and under fingernails. Some developed dermatitis so severe that small blisters formed, leaking pus that stained the cloth as they continued to fasten bodices for fear of offending their majestic mistress. From those initial sores, bacteria spread into deeper tissues, leading to painful cellulitis in arms and shoulders. The same attendants who once admired the queen's regal silhouette found themselves confined to the infirmary, racked with fevers and chills. Their pain was exacerbated by the fabrics that clung damply to their injured skin whenever they adjusted the hems during a fitting. Each pull and tuck became an agony, as if the gown itself were punishing them. Because these gowns were considered sacrosanct personal items of royal property, they were never washed in water. Instead, they were hung in sealed wardrobes filled with fragrant sachets and bundles of dried lavender, intended to purify the air. But without proper laundering, the oils and secretions baked into the fabric under torchlight, creating a perfect breeding ground for mold and mildew. Some chroniclers later noted dark green or black spots along seams and underlinings, clear evidence of fungal growth. The cycle of infection extended beyond the maids. After dressing the queen, they might help bring her to state functions, where courtiers and envoys would press closer to admire the embroidery, inhale the perfume, and inadvertently pick up traces of contamination. A slight brush of a sleeve, a casual touch on a sash, each contact delivered bacteria onto collars, gloves, and even the royal carriages themselves. In this way, the queen's garments acted like vectors, carrying pathogens from one high-ranking guest to the next. Habit number 2 thus became a silent catalyst for court-wide outbreaks of skin infections, fevers, and unexplained rashes. Nobles who attended a single audience could return home with lesions on their arms, perplexing their personal physicians. Some reported that their servants fell ill shortly after handling the queen's discarded gloves and ribbons. Others described lingering headaches and nausea that they attributed to the overwhelming musk and rosewater used in an attempt to disguise the true source. Yet despite mounting illnesses, no one dared suggest that the gowns themselves be washed. To launder such delicate embroidered robes risked wrecking the painstaking craftsmanship. Instead, the queen's household doubled down on perfuming and brushing the fabrics with soft horsehair brushes, believing that removing surface dust would suffice. But those brushes, used again and again, accumulated their own filth, transferring grime from one layer of gown to another. By the end of the day, the palace corridors were lined with gowns hung on walnut pegs. Their skirts, skimming the plush carpets, released faint clouds of powder and spores with every breeze from an open window. The air, already heavy with candle smoke and cooking fires, grew colder and thicker, charged with an unseen miasma. Yet this miasma was not merely the product of supernatural humours, but the result of hundreds of pounds of unwashed silk and wool, teeming with bacteria and fungus. In retrospect, it seems almost comical that such prized attire could so thoroughly undermine the health of a royal court. But to those suffering from inflamed skin and raging fevers, the humour was scant and distant. They could only shiver beneath perfumed cloaks, clutching at bodices that cut into their reddened flesh, praying for relief that never came. Disgusting hygiene habit number 3. The queen's wigs, lead powder, and infestation. Even beyond her real scalp, Elizabeth I's magnificent wigs concealed an unimaginably filthy secret. They became mobile, living nests for countless pathogens. Under thick layers of finely milled white lead powder and cloyingly sweet perfume, each wig fostered colonies of mold, bacteria, and parasitic insects. The lead powder applied daily to sustain that brilliant chalk-white hue smothered the base beneath, choking the skin so that it could not breathe under the heavy fabrics and stiff animal hair. This created the perfect, humid environment for fungal colonies to flourish, while stray lice and small blood-sucking parasites multiplied in the dark underlayers of the wigs. Each morning, the Queen's ladies-in-waiting fragile court attendants summoned to enhance her regal appearance were required to lift and unpin multiple wig layers, handling them with their bare hands. Without the slightest notion of protective gloves, they combed and reshaped the wigs, embedding into their nails and the creases of their palms thick crusts of dead skin, sweat, body oils, and the persistent dust of lead. With each gentle stroke of the comb, they dislodged clouds of unseen bacteria and parasitic lice, releasing fungal spores of candida, itching lice, and golden staff colonies formerly entombed in matted strands of hair. Those attendants, standing mere inches away from the Queen, inhaled that toxic miasma and then ran their fingers through their own hair, introducing the same pathogens directly onto their own scalps. In the following days, they would suffer fierce itching, red welts, and then hair loss in clumps. Their scalps would fester, sometimes oozing viscous pus, forcing them to the infirmary. There, the royal physicians, ignorant of germ theory, prescribed more herbal salves and miracle mercurial ointments meant to draw out the poison. Each application only deepened the wounds, and the maids returned to duty reeking of both decay and sweet fragrance, trapped in a cycle of infection that never ceased. Those wooden combs, proclaimed private royal possessions, were never discarded or even washed. After each use, they were simply wiped with a soft cloth and returned to an ornately carved wooden box, its lid snapped shut to preserve the illusion of dignified seclusion. Inside that box, Moisture from sweat and pus pooled within the grain, providing an ideal hideaway for bacteria and spores to multiply. Then, a day or two later, another unsuspecting attendant would open the box, dust off the grimy comb, and continue the same ritual. Thus formed an unbroken chain of contagion. Queen's scalp lead, encrusted comb servant's scalp comb again, exponential spread throughout the palace. Over time, repeated exposure to these contaminated wigs caused some attendants to develop vivid, blistering infestations of actinomyces and candida deep within their skin. These fungal colonies burrowed beneath the surface, forming painful abscess-like nodules that leaked thick, yellowish pus. Some maids suffered extensive tissue breakdown, leaving them with permanent scars. These open sores invited further bacterial infections, resulting in high fevers, chills, and hours of agonizing pain that they endured in silence, fearful of missing a command or insulting royal decorum. Meanwhile, courtiers and foreign dignitaries called upon to help adjust the Queen's elaborate headdresses before important state functions also fell prey. As they leaned close to repin a curl or steady an ornate cap, they inhaled choking clouds of lead dust and fungal spores. Their hands, brushing accidentally against an infected servant's sleeve or regally embroidered cloak, then carried the pathogens onto their own clothing, seat cushions, and hats. Thus, the Queen's wigs acted as lethal vectors, moving disease from the palace's inner sanctum into the wider world beyond. No washing ritual was ever applied to these hairpieces. Instead, they were aired out on carved wooden stands, or gently patted with whisks of dried lavender and rosemary, an attempted gesture of purification that only served to disturb the microbial ecosystems within. When the Queen finally removed her wig at night, the surrounding air would shimmer with fine particles of lead and broken skin, drifting down and landing on the polished floorboards. Servants returning to tend the wigs after she retired would stir that dust once again, resuming the cycle before dawn. The daily use and storage of these wigs in shared chests created communal vaults of contagion. Stored alongside other royal garments, silk gowns, velvet coats, and perfumed gloves, the wigs' infestation bled across fabrics. Chambers designated safe and contaminated were divided by heavy tapestries, yet microbes slipped beneath the smallest crack, spread along the walls, and hitchhiked on gowns carried by servants into adjacent rooms. The entire palace interior, once the epitome of regal splendor, became a slow-motion pathogen factory. Horrifyingly, some officials noted that the wig's incessant use led to widespread absenteeism among attendants. Noble families whispered of daughters once privileged to serve the Queen returning home with inflamed skin, fevers, and discolored nails that fell away in their beds. Rumors circulated of secret maladies referred to as court blushes or shadow fevers, but no official record connected these illnesses to the Queen's hairstyles. Instead, they were dismissed as routine sacrifices made in service to the crown. For the Queen herself, this nightmare of infestation passed largely unnoticed. She continued to present her powdered visage, weaving political power with every carefully arranged curl. Yet behind the velvet curtains, her loyal attendants suffered in silence, scratching at invisible invaders and praying the next day's rituals would spare them further agony. Their sacrifices were recorded only by empty beds and unexplained absences, ghostly footnotes in the royal household ledger. Disgusting hygiene habit number 4, the infection cycle in the palace and contemporary medicine. Despite its glittering grandeur, the palace was never truly clean. Corridors ran thick with dust. Heavy tapestries absorbed every drop of spilled drink, and the very stones seemed to harbor invisible armies of microbes. In this environment, infection thrived. Servants and ladies-in-waiting shared cramped bedchambers, sleeping side by side on narrow pallet beds. They used the same coarse sheets, rough blankets, and feather-stuffed pillows, unwittingly perpetuating the cycle of contamination. When infected secretions and flakes of dead skin fell from powdered wigs and lead-smeared faces onto the bedding, the linens became silent incubators for pathogens. A single flake of infected skin landing on a pillowcase was enough to start the chain reaction. At night, body heat pressed those microbes into the fabric, allowing them to come into direct contact with the sleeper's skin. Under that pressure, the pathogens invaded tiny hair follicles and scraped abrasion sites, triggering intense itching and burning. Within hours, small red bumps blossomed into angry pustules, then ulcers, and finally deep, spreading infections. Contemporary medicine in Elizabethan England was hardly up to the task. Physicians still clung to the humoral theory, believing that disease arose from imbalances in the four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, rather than recognizing germs. When confronted with festering sores or rampant fevers, they prescribed laxatives to purge excess humours, or they applied herbal poultices and more mercury ointments meant to draw out the poison. These treatments only ravaged the skin more profoundly, enlarging ulcers and deepening the mildew of disease. Without any concept of sterilization, no physician dared propose burning bedding or bleaching sheets in hot water. Instead, when a servant collapsed with a spreading infection, they simply replaced her with a fresh recruit. The new servant inherited the same unwashed sheets and the same mouldy blankets. Within weeks, or even a few days, she too would succumb to fever and festering wounds, then be carried off. The palace register would note her departure as death by sudden illness, and a newcomer would take her place. Thus, a tragic cycle emerged. One servant died, another arrived to fill her role, and the infection moved on. This endless loop of recruitment and demise maintained a perpetual cloud of contagion over the palace. Employees rotated through the kitchen, the laundry, and the Queen's private chambers, each role exposing them to contaminated textiles and surfaces. No area remained safe. Door handles, chair arms, cupboard latches all bore deposits of infected skin or bodily fluids. Society of that era had no concept of modern personal hygiene. Bathing was rare and often discouraged. Water itself was mistrusted, seen as a potential source of disease rather than its remedy. Clothes and linens were seldom washed in water, for fear the textiles would shrink or the dyes run. Instead, they were draped outdoors on sunny days, if the weather permitted, and perfumed with rosewater or lungwort to mask foul odours. But the scent could not penetrate deep into the fibres, leaving microbes free to multiply across seasons. Cloaks and gowns passed from servant to servant, each handling them without ever thinking to disinfect. A lady-in-waiting might borrow a sleeve corsage for an evening's dance, only to return it afterward to the Queen's wardrobe, not realizing she was reintroducing new pathogens to the court's most dangerous wardrobe. Thus, each generation of palace staff inherited not only the Queen's favours but also her contagious ailments. Treatment remained almost wholly ineffective. Physicians could soothe symptoms with compresses of violet leaves or cabbage, but they could not stop the real culprit: the endless reservoir of infection built into the palace's very fabric. Servants languished in infirmaries, drained of strength by persistent fevers and valueless salves. When they did recover, they often carried lifelong scars, physical reminders of how the palace's sumptuous trappings hid a deeper rot. The horrific truth is that each ornate chamber, aglow with flickering candlelight, concealed a death trap. The bright tapestries and polished floors masked the hidden threat. Blankets and gowns, still damp from perspiration, nurtured bacterial growth in every seam. Each tapestry fold was a stall for microbes. Each silk cushion was a sponge for infection. The very opulence that signalled majesty became a breeding ground for decay. For any brave soul who dared reside within those walls, escape from the silent murderer, microscopic and unfathomable, was nearly impossible. They might survive court intrigues or battles abroad, but they could not escape the invisible plague that rode in on velvet hems and feather pillows. In their final moments, many servants could only clutch at damp sheets and curse the day they had entered royal service. Disgusting hygiene habit number 5. Lavish gowns, the bacteria trap. Elizabeth I's silk and pearl-embroidered gowns, her thick velvet and sumptuous satin, were not merely symbols of royal power, they were mobile incubators for a deadly array of pathogens. These luxurious fabrics, silk, velvet, satin, absorbed every drop of moisture, sweat from the Queen's skin, menstrual blood during her cycle, and unwashed secretions. Once saturated, the fibres remained damp, creating an ideal environment for Staphylococcus aureus, Streptococcus species, and various fungi such as Candida to flourish. Yet these costly garments were never laundered properly. To avoid damaging the delicate embroidery, they were seldom washed in water. Instead, they were refreshed with perfumed waters, rose petal sachets, or dustings of lavender-scented powder, meant to temporarily mask the odours without removing the underlying contamination. When Elizabeth prepared for court, A retinue of ladies-in-waiting gathered to dress her. Each attendant lifted layers of heavy skirts, hooked corset laces, and pulled taut the hidden stays. In doing so, they pressed their ungloved fingertips into fabric that had absorbed weeks or months of infectious material. A tiny tear in the delicate skin of a hand or forearm, barely noticeable, was enough for bacteria to slip in and begin multiplying. Almost immediately, a small red bump would form. Left untreated, it would grow into a painful ulcer, weeping pus and burning with infection. These wounds were often dismissed as court nicks or pinpricks. Servants tried to bandage them using strips of linen left over from the queen's undergarments, strips themselves riddled with pathogens. The lack of any sterilization meant each bandage change simply reintroduced bacteria to the lesion, deepening the infection. Nurses whispered prayers over the afflicted women, their voices trembling, but the remedies of the time, herbal salves, bloodletting to correct the so-called humoral imbalance, or mercurial ointments to draw out poison, only made matters worse. The servants' arms swelled with inflammation, and some developed systemic infections that led to fevers, chills, and eventual collapse. Yet, even as the injuries multiplied, the cycle perpetuated. A single gown required dozens of people to handle it. Tailors who measured and cut, seamstresses who sewed, perfumers who dusted on scented powders, launderers who brushed off visible dirt, and porters who moved the finished garment into storage. Each person touched the fabric and carried away invisible pathogens on their skin and clothing. When the gown was returned to its wardrobe, the dried biological material sweat, blood, discharge hardened into crusts that preserved the infectious agents for months on end. On the next occasion, a fresh set of hands lifted the same garment. As the attendants brushed off excess powder, they released clouds of microbes and dust back into the air of the dressing chamber. Anyone standing too close in hopes of glimpsing the Queen's grace found themselves at risk. Courtiers and diplomats who helped steady the Queen's skirts or clasp her cloak inhaled fungal spores and bacterial droplets, unwittingly introducing them to their own households when they returned home. Thus, the palace's lavish gowns served as vectors, carrying disease into the wider world beyond the court's high walls. Compounding the danger was the Queen's own use of mercurial cosmetics. Fine residues of mercury clung to the interiors of the gowns, mixing with the biological detritus. When a maid brushed against the Queen's skirt, her skin absorbed not only microbes but also trace amounts of heavy metal. Over time, lead and mercury poisoning aggravated the chronic infections, ulcers that refused to heal, nerve pain, and widespread weakness in the arms and torso. Yet physicians, convinced that more metallic salves would conceal cosmetic blemishes, continued to recommend their use, deepening the chemical insult to the skin and fabric alike. A gown worn once was not safe for a second use until it had been ceremonially aired out, typically by hanging it in a sunlit gallery weather permitting, or by gently patting it with horsehair brushes. These brushes, however, were never cleaned. They became repositories of dust, hair fragments, and secretions. When attendants used them, they simply swept that accumulated grime deeper into the fabric. The palace air, thick with candle smoke and perfumed incense, became saturated with invisible clouds of bacteria-laden dust whenever a new gown was displayed. Eventually, the wardrobe itself transformed into an enormous vault of infection. Wardrobe-trained servants, those entrusted with the care of the Queen's clothes, became the most dangerous vectors of all. They moved gowns from shelf to shelf, stacking them alongside ceremonial cloaks and coronation robes, ensuring that every item passed through the same foul cycle. The gowns never truly dried. Moisture from late-night humidity and the Queen's perspiration created microclimates within folds that remained damp for days. Perhaps worst of all, the gowns were touched by uncounted hands over generations. Young girls entering court service inherited garments once worn by dozens, each of whom could have carried an active infection. The palace staff rotated frequently, and no one realized that every new recruit came into contact, not with a fresh garment, but with an ancient reservoir of disease. Disgusting hygiene habit number 6, Elizabethan medicine and its helpless remedies. In the midst of the Queen's rot epidemic that swept through the palace, Elizabethan medicine proved utterly powerless before the onslaught of microbes. Royal physicians clung to the outdated four humours theory, believing health depended upon a balance of blood, phlegm, choler, yellow bile, and melancholy, black bile, and never recognized bacteria, Fungi, or parasites as causes of disease. When the queen or her servants developed festering sores, oozing ulcers, or swollen lymph nodes, doctors diagnosed humoral imbalance, organ weakness, or the vaguely defined mercurial poisoning, a catch, all term for numerous afflictions. Their standard treatments were as misguided as they were harmful. Physicians applied topical herbal mixtures, aloe vera gel, crushed mugwort leaves, or pounded beetle leaves to soothe irritated skin. They followed these with greasy salves, laced with mercury or powdered lead, convinced that these substances would draw out the poison. To mask the odours and lighten scars, they often suggested ingesting potent tinctures made of wine infused with secret family blends of spices and roots. Yet, far from curing the disease, these toxic metals only deepened wounds, widening ulcers, and intensifying the foul stench that clung to the queen's antechambers. Bloodletting, purging, and cupping were also routine. The court's barbers and surgeons would lance skin, withdraw pints of supposedly tainted blood, or administer harsh laxatives and emetics. They believed these measures would restore humoral harmony by expelling excess fluids. Instead, each bleed and purge left patients weakened and dehydrated, their immune systems shattered to pieces. A lady in waiting might survive a single bloodletting only to collapse hours later, too anemic to rise from her pallet bed. Frantic and uncertain, doctors rotated through various strategies with little success. Sometimes they scraped the skin with heated coins or applied charcoal powder to char the infection. Other times they burned bundles of herbs, rosemary, juniper, and frankincense in an attempt to fumigate infected rooms, while patients inhaled suffocating plumes of smoke. There was also the promise of cod liver oil, believed to soothe wounds from within. Patients took spoonfuls daily, only to find their bedding and gowns further sullied by its rancid residue, providing yet more nourishment for mold and mildew. Meanwhile, those servants who had survived fevers and open ulcers were ordered back to court duties almost immediately. A maid, still sweaty and feverish, would be sent to comb the queen's hair, lace her gowns, or change her linens. Each time, she re-exposed herself to the very pathogens that had nearly killed her. Any lingering scab or scabbed-over ulcer on her hands reopened with the slightest brush, allowing bacteria a fresh point of entry and perpetuating the cycle of infection. On a larger scale, the palace's administration prioritized image over health. Advisors and courtiers bristled at any suggestion that royal majesty might be endangered by unspeakable sores or the stench of decay. Although some enlightened physicians privately warned of sanitation reforms insisting on clean water, regular bathing, and proper laundering, such ideas were dismissed as impractical or beneath the dignity of the court. Only when so many attendants lay incapacitated, unable to serve, did officials reluctantly isolate certain chambers and sprinkle carafes of vinegar in the corners. Yet the disinfection was perfunctory at best, a pale token rather than a true solution. In the weeks that followed, illnesses persisted unabated. Court ladies, warehouse clerks, and even stable hands fell ill. The stables themselves, once thought a refuge from the palace's gloom, became sites of contamination, as soiled linens from the infirmary were washed alongside horse blankets. Families of the servants who returned home carried the infections into taverns, workshops, and even the kitchens of minor nobles. The rot spread like wildfire through corridors of power and across the city's narrow lanes. The tragic outcome was a parade of gaunt, hollow-eyed attendants. Hands marred by non-healing ulcers, arms stiff with scar tissue, and bodies racked by lingering fevers. Deaths were recorded in hush-hush notes as sudden decline or weakness of spirit, while the true cause remained unspoken. The royal archives preserved only the barest entries, for to admit the mortality of those who served the Queen would have been unthinkable. Disgusting hygiene habit number 6. Elizabethan medicine and its helpless remedies teaches a grim lesson about the importance of understanding disease and the fatal consequences of ignoring proper hygiene. As you drift towards sleep, picture the feverish nights of the palace infirmary. Doctors fumbling with leech jars and poultices made from toxic metals, servants clutching at soiled sheets, and the distant echo of footsteps called to serve again. May your dreams be spared such suffering, and may the peace of rest be yours, untainted by the horrors of a time when ignorance reigned over the healing arts. Disgusting hygiene. Habit number 7. Wigs, headpieces, and the battle with lice and mites. Wigs and elaborate headpieces, symbols of ultimate power and peak fashion, hid a grim secret. They became cozy nurseries for lice, mites, and mold. These thick hairpieces, crafted from horsehair, wool, or early synthetic fibers, were plastered with layers of white lead powder and perfumed dust to maintain a pristine appearance. The lead powder, though it lent an air of sacred dignity, sealed in moisture and heat, suffocating the strands beneath and creating a damp, warm sanctuary where parasitic insects thrived unseen. Each morning, the Queen's most experienced ladies-in-waiting would gently remove the headpiece layers, often with bare hands or thin kid gloves, never anything approaching sterilization. As they combed through the heavy wigs, they disturbed the hidden inhabitants. Small red mites scuttled along the base, searching for skin to bite, while blood-sucking lice emerged from their powdery hiding places to feast. In the process, the attendants' fingers became vectors, carrying these pests from the wig to their own scalps and clothing. With each shed skin flake, each tiny drop of perspiration trapped in the fibers, the wig became more heavily infested. Lice that had gorged themselves on the Queen's scalp now leapt onto the ladies-in-waiting, eliciting agonizing itching that drove them to scratch until little abrasions formed. These tiny scratches opened portals for bacteria to invade, resulting in pustules and painful infections that required extensive bandaging. Bandages themselves rarely clean, further entrenching the cycle. After styling, the Queen replaced her wigs, and the used headpieces were placed on carved wooden stands, lined up for the next day's appointment. Over the hours, perspiration and scalp oils dripped into the wig interiors, mixing with fungal spores and dead skin to build a thriving microbial community. Without proper washing, the only attempted cleaning was a brisk shake or a soft dusting with more scented powder. This superficial refresh merely drove the pests deeper into the fibers, while the underlying infestation multiplied unchecked. The continuous wearing of these wigs for hours each day also left the Queen's own scalp vulnerable. Trapped under the suffocating layers of powdered hair, her skin could not breathe. The consistent warmth and dampness under the wig's base allowed fungi such as candida to colonize, causing relentless itching, flaky scales, and raw, oozing sores on her head. When the Queen finally did remove the wig, attendants sometimes glimpsed red, inflamed patches and felt damp clinging to their gloves. Yet there was no remedy. The wigs went back onto their stands, ready for reuse. Even those above the rank of maid diplomats, chamberlains, and visiting nobility fell victim. A nobleman summoned to adjust the Queen's elaborate coiffure might lean in too close, his fingers brushing against an infested curl. Within days, he would find himself scratching at his collar, his scalp burning with the irritation of new lice hatching unnoticed. Every proverbial favour of trimming a stray curl or setting a jewelled pin risked transmission. Thus, the palace engaged in a relentless cycle of infect, scratch, infect again. Each wig, never sanitized in hot water or boiled in any disinfecting solution, became more deeply contaminated. There were no formal guidelines for wig maintenance, no routine boiling, no immersion in antifungal decoctions, no scheduled replacement of hair fibers. Instead, centuries-old wigs remained in use, gathering ever-thickening layers of organic waste, parasite eggs, and mold spores. Adding insult to injury, the heavy metal residues from the Queen's makeup traces of lead and mercury remained embedded in the wigs. When a fresh hand adjusted a hairpiece, those toxic particles mixed with insect droppings and fungal byproducts, creating a complex chemical stew that burned delicate skin and irritated respiratory passages. Attendants who inhaled an errant puff of lead dust often complained of headaches and dizziness before the relentless itch set in. No wonder that the ladies-in-waiting seemed perpetually fatigued and pale. They moved through the palace corridors as walking, scratching portraits of misery, their refined gowns and starched collars belying the horrors beneath. Each night, they removed the wigs and carefully returned them to the wooden racks, never once considering that their sacred duty perpetuated the very epidemic they silently dreaded. Disgusting hygiene habit number 7. The battle against lice, mites, and mold in royal wigs left no corner of the court untouched. Even as the Queen basked in her ceremonial splendor, those who ensured her magnificence endured a nightmare of parasitic invasion. The palace, in its splendor, became an open-air laboratory of pests and microbes, and every wig stand a breeding ground for the tiniest killers. As you drift into drowsiness, imagine the faint scratching beneath voluminous curls and the soft rustle of horsehair concealing unseen armies. Picture the gentle hands that tremble under the dual assault of itching and obligation, and let the darkness cradle you until morning safely arrives far from the hidden horrors of Elizabethan headgear. Disgusting hygiene, habit number 8. The commodes and death from the lidless throne. In the Queen's private bedchamber stood a simple yet deadly fixture, the commode. This essential vessel, intended to preserve the monarch's dignity by sparing her the journey to distant latrines, became a literal death trap for her servants. The commode lacked a lid and any form of protective lining. After each use, it was merely wiped out with a rough cloth before being set aside. Over time, human waste accumulated in its bowl, transforming into a festering pool of bacteria and a miasma of intolerable stench. The task of emptying this bowl fell to the lowest-ranking servants. With bare hands, never gloves, each would seize the commode by its rim and carry it through the dimly lit corridors to the nearest drain or open ditch. As they strode, droplets of fecal matter splashed against their skin, onto their garments, and seeped into the soles of their shoes. The odorous trail they left behind filled hallways and chambers, heralding the arrival of disease long before the servants themselves appeared. Contained within that sludge were countless colonies of Escherichia coli, Salmonella species, and the dreaded Vibrio cholerae, the pathogen responsible for cholera. Each time a servant touched a doorknob, leaned against a tapestry, or placed a hand on a work table, they deposited fresh spores and bacteria onto surfaces others would soon contact. Few realized that handling food or kitchen implements, once their shift brought them near the galley, they carried the seeds of gastrointestinal plagues directly into pots of stew and loaves of bread. Symptoms struck quickly. Within hours of exposure, victims suffered violent diarrhea, relentless vomiting, and crippling abdominal cramps. Dehydration set in with terrifying speed, draining their strength until they could no longer stand. Without intravenous fluids or knowledge of rehydration, many perished within days. Their deaths were recorded in the palace rolls under vague labels, decline of strength, or bodily weakness, carefully obscuring the true cause of their demise. Those assigned to the commode post seemed to vanish overnight. One servant would appear at dawn, shoulders hunched beneath the filthy bowl, and by dusk would be gone, replaced by another hapless worker. The cycle of recruitment and fatal illness turned the commode station into an infamous graveyard. Staff haunted the corridors, whispering that no one would volunteer for that post twice. Each new appointee was certain to take the place of the last. Compounding the danger, the contaminated clothing and battered leather shoes of these servants were stored alongside other uniforms in the palace wardrobe. The pathogens clinging to hems and soles colonized wood shelves and metal pegs, ready to hitch a ride on the next garment worn. A senior lady in waiting, reaching for a spare cloak, might unknowingly don a robe steeped in bacteria, inviting sickness to her own chambers. Attempts at masking the odor and stopping the spread proved woefully inadequate. A spritz of rosewater, a smattering of dried herbs, or a handful of aromatic oils tucked into the commode's rim did nothing to arrest the microbial onslaught. No servant ever employed soap or a scrub brush, nor was anyone instructed to cover the bowl with a tight-fitting lid. Instead, the palace relied on perfumed waters to gloss over the revolting reality. But the microorganisms knew no respect for royal airs. This appalling neglect exemplifies the utter failure of palace hygiene. A tool meant to provide convenience and preserve royal stature became the epicenter of disease transmission. The lack of simple safety measures, gloves, lids, disinfecting washes, turned the private quarters into a quarantine zone where invisible killers lurked in plain sight. Each night, as courtiers exchanged polite whispers about the Queen's grace, they also inhaled faint echoes of decay, drifting from corridors just out of view. Disgusting hygiene habit number 8. The commodes and the death from the lidless throne serves as a haunting reminder of the consequences when ignorance meets indifference. Let the image of those silent hallways, stained with unseen contamination, guide you into the comforting oblivion of sleep. May your dreams be free of the horrors that lurked behind the Queen's lavish curtains and within the humble vessel meant only to serve. Disgusting hygiene habit number 9. Menstrual cloths. The hidden plague in the royal kitchen. In the labyrinthine operations of the royal household, few duties were as invisible and as perilous as laundering the Queen's menstrual cloths. These soft linen swathes, stained deeply with blood, sweat, and other secretions, were washed by hand in stagnant basins of tepid water and then hung to dry. Once brittle or faded, they were simply rinsed again and reused, unaware that each reuse further embedded pathogens into the very fibres that came into contact with the Queen's most intimate anatomy. The Laresses, those lowest in the laundry hierarchy, performed this grim task without so much as a pair of gloves or any protective barrier. They shared basins, wooden washboards, and coarse scrubbing brushes with those used for kitchen linens, from dish towels to tablecloths. Escherichia coli and other gut bacteria clung stubbornly to the menstrual rags, hiding in every interlaced thread. When the same basins and brushes were next used to wash the tea towels or polishing cloths for pots and pans, the pathogens transferred seamlessly from the menstrual cloths onto utensils and dishware. In the bustling royal kitchens, the consequences were swift and brutal. Within days, dozens of cooks and kitchen servants began suffering violent bouts of diarrhea, relentless vomiting, and crippling dehydration. High fevers racked their bodies as intestinal inflammation progressed unchecked. The kitchens, once a sanctified domain of culinary artistry, became a breeding ground for disease. A single pinch of stew skimmed from a cauldron contaminated by a Lares's rag could introduce E. coli into a bowl destined for a duke or foreign ambassador. Royal records grew heavy with entries noting severe illness or intestinal weakness among the kitchen staff, though no specifics were ever provided. Dozens of loyal servants simply vanished, carried off by acute gastroenteritis. Some succumbed to complications within 72 hours, their bodies collapsing under the strain of fluid loss and toxic bacterial invasion. Those who survived faced weeks of lingering weakness, their once steady hands trembling as they tried to stoke fires and portion loaves of bread. No formal protocol existed to cleanse the laundry implements or segregate menstrual textiles from kitchen linens. The Laresses, exhausted and fearful, might rinse a used rag in the same basin that minutes earlier had held the cloth used to wipe dining benches. They then draped both items side by side on the same line to dry, the hot midday sun providing only a superficial aid against the tenacious microbes nestled within the fabrics. The palace's ivory-towered isolation only magnified the problem. No one dared demand clean water or bottled vinegar strong enough to disinfect. The idea of boiling the menstrual cloths in copper cauldrons, though it would have killed most bacteria, was deemed impractical and beneath the dignity of royal garments. The very notion of isolating those cloths, storing them separately, or discarding them after a single use, was unthinkable in a court obsessed with economy and tradition. As plates of meat and bowls of pottage passed from the speckled marble countertops to the polished hands of noble diners, the spectre of contamination lingered with each serving. A single slipper ladle passed from a trembling chef to a tired footman could introduce fresh waves of pathogens into the highest ranks of the court. Even the Queen herself, so long insulated from daily chores, was not immune. Her personal dishes for morning gruel and tea were set upon sideboards previously dusted by cloths that had wiped menstrual items. Thus, disgusting hygiene habit. Number 9. Menstrual cloths. The hidden plague in the royal kitchen reveals how neglecting basic personal hygiene can ripple outward into catastrophe. Here, a task intended to safeguard the Queen's privacy instead unleashed an invisible epidemic upon the entire household. As you cradle your pillow and let sleep descend, imagine the soft linen soaked in blood, the unseeing Lares plunging her hands into murky water, and the silent spread of disease that followed each drop of that tainted rinse. May your dreams spare you such horrors, and may you awake refreshed, far from the miasma that once haunted palace kitchens. Disgusting hygiene habit number 10. Breath-borne infection and oral thrush. The Queen's invisible weapon. Elizabeth I was celebrated for her articulate speech and charismatic presence. Yet lurking behind that power was a far more insidious force, her breath. Coated in layers of white lead and mercury powder to achieve the flawless complexion she demanded, her lips and gums became perpetually inflamed. In the moist crevices of her mouth, candida yeast established colonies, while Staphylococcus bacteria multiplied freely. The very act of speaking thus exhaled clouds of spores and microbes, transforming the queen's oratory into a weapon of unseen contagion. Those in closest proximity, her secretaries, clerks, and chamber officials, found themselves naively inhaling each declaration of state or reading of letters. They handled parchment and quills, then brought restless fingers to their own lips, transferring fungal cells and bacteria directly into their oral cavities. Initial symptoms were mild: a scratchy throat, a thin yellow discharge on the tongue's surface, and a persistent hoarseness. But within days, those faint signs escalated into agonizing soreness, thick white patches that clung to mucous membranes, and swelling so severe that swallowing became torture. As the infection spread deeper, it descended into the lungs, manifesting as protracted coughing fits and high fevers. Many a diligent scribe, laboring over hours of correspondence, collapsed under the weight of relentless hacking and the chill of intense shivers. A handful fainted mid-sentence, their quills clattering onto the desk as their bodies gave way to the advancing disease. Yet the danger did not end there. Each exhalation sent microscopic droplets of saliva and fungal spores outward into the air, where they settled onto handkerchiefs, hats, and the plush velvet of nearby seat cushions. Staphylococcus, eager to exploit even the tiniest abrasion, lurked on these surfaces. A nobleman, leaning in to whisper counsel or to watch the queen adjust a jeweled pin, might feel a prickle at the nape of his neck. Once he brushed the spot and touched his sleeve, the bacteria found a fresh gateway into the bloodstream, leading to localized infections that festered into abscesses. Worse still, the queen's frequent coughs drove impure droplets onto the very implements of dining. Silver spoons, pewter goblets, and porcelain cups caught her infected exhalations. The hands that then polished those vessels used nothing more than perfumed waters, rose water, lavender distillate, or spiced vinegars to clean them. Without soap or scalding water, the microbes clung stubbornly, jumping from utensil to server to unsuspecting guest. Soon, courtiers dining on thin soups and honeyed meats developed similar symptoms: oral thrush, swollen gums, and chest infections that sometimes proved fatal. Even the humble chore of tidying the queen's chamber concealed fresh hazards. Linens and hangings, air-dried in the stillness of the night, absorbed her tainted breath like sponges. Chambermaids, tasked with brushing the bed curtains or straightening the embroidered pillowcases, inadvertently inhaled the trapped spores. A single sweep of their feather dusters would unleash a fine cloud into the stale air, lodging fungal cells deep in their nasal passages and trickling down into their throats. Each dawn saw another wave of illness. A groom who polished the bedposts coughed as he stroked the wood. A valet, adjusting the queen's gowns, felt a bitter taste before a rash of white film coated his tongue. They endured these afflictions as silent sacrifices, bound by duty to serve and forbidden to refuse proximity to their sovereign. No formal protocols existed to manage airborne illness. The notion of air quarantine was as alien as the concept of antiseptic surgery. There were no screens, no closed doors, no even simple hand-washing before and after an audience. The only concession was to burn scented woods, sandalwood, frankincense, or cedar in bronze censers, hoping that the fragrant smoke might neutralize the foul odors. In reality, it did nothing to arrest the spread of yeast and bacteria floating invisibly through the corridors. Thus, disgusting hygiene habit number 10, breath-borne infection and oral thrush, stands as a stark testament to how the most ordinary act, breathing, became a vector for widespread disease. In her quest to present an unblemished visage, Elizabeth inadvertently nurtured colonies of pathogens in the moist sanctum of her mouth. Each word she pronounced, each breath she exhaled, carried the seeds of fungal invasion and bacterial onslaught into the bodies of her closest confidants. Imagine the hush of candlelight in the great hall, the Queen's voice echoing against tapestried walls, and feel the phantom tickle of spores settling on your skin. As you close your eyes to sleep, let the memory of that cold, silent threat slip away and rest in the comforting knowledge that you breathe safe and untainted air, far from the infected exhalations of a monarch's lethal whisper. Good night. Disgusting hygiene. Habit number 11. The death trap, furnishings, curtains, carpets, and mould. Within the gilded halls of Elizabeth I's palace, sumptuous velvet drapes, silken bed hangings, and plush tapestries spoke of unrivaled wealth. Yet these opulent fabrics, symbols of regal authority, harbored a far darker secret. They formed the perfect breeding grounds for deadly mold and bacteria. In the damp, chilly air of a Tudor castle, Aspergillus and Penicillium species thrived within every fibre of velvet, silk and wool. Each revolution of the seasons only deepened the infestation, as the soft folds trapped moisture from pooled candle wax smoke, from the queen's perspiration, and from countless layers of lead-based powder that sifted into the threads. Servants entrusted with the task of chamber maintenance, most often junior maids armed only with feather dusters and coarse cloths, knew too well the futility of their efforts. They would approach a grand window, perch a step-stool beneath its heavy drape, and sweep vigorously across the sooty surface. Yet the underlying reality was that they disturbed thick blankets of contaminated dust, sending a fine cloud of spores into the stagnant air. Those spores, invisible to the naked eye, settled upon the nurses' and pages' clothing, upon the polished wooden floors, and upon the delicate porcelain of side tables. Time and again, those same unsuspecting workers found themselves coughing through their shifts. An attendant wiping the carved walnut chairs in the Queen's private anteroom would inhale a sudden onrush of mould particles, triggering a fierce bout of bronchial inflammation. They endured tightness in the chest, rattling coughs that echoed through hushed corridors, and fevers that left them delirious under the faint glow of tallow candles. Some servants collapsed, their lungs oozing fluid in a disease later described clinically as pneumonic distress or consumptive flux. Meanwhile, corridors laid with rich carpets woven from the finest wools and silks served as highways for the invisible plague. Each footstep crushed decades of accumulated spores, crushing them anew before releasing them back into the air with a faint rustle. Pages in the Queen's retinue, clad in livery whose cuffs perpetually brushed along the carpet's deep nap, carried these spores from grand audiences to kitchens and privies alike. No threshold, no matter how heavily guarded, could stop the advance of airborne contagion. In rare moments of perceived cleanliness, the palace authorities resorted to fumigating chambers with smoothed bundles of dried herbs. Rosemary, lavender, and juniper boughs were ignited in braziers, and their resinous smoke was wafted into every corner. This ritual, more ceremony than sanitation, filled the halls with a perfumed haze that soothed the senses, but did nothing to kill the tenacious spores sinking deep into the weave of the fabric. Occasionally, a curtain deemed too rank was removed from its rod and hauled outside for a sunning ritual. In a seldom bright hour, maids would spread the heavy cloths across the battlements, or hang them along exposed walls, hoping ultraviolet rays would purge the worst of the mould. But the English sun so often failed to penetrate the thick folds, and the chilly breeze that followed left the fabric damp once more, sealing in whatever spores remained. When the curators of the royal wardrobe did deign to order a full laundering, an arduous, days-long endeavour, it involved hauling the curtain down, scrambling to a nearby courtyard, and dunking the heavy textile into a trough of cold water. Then it was lathered with rainwater soap, rinsed in the same waterway used for cleaning boots and scullery equipment, and finally hung to drip dry. By the time it was rehung, the curtain had already picked up fresh contaminants from clothespins, wooden frames, and even the hands of the loresses themselves. Thus, the very fabrics intended to symbolize permanence and splendor became conduits for indiscriminate infection. The court physicians, called upon to explain these mysterious coughs and fevers, fell back on theories of corrupted humors and stagnant air. They recommended bleeding or vigorous exercise to open the pores, which only drove exhausted patients back into the contaminated halls, too weak to escape the mold-ridden air. For visiting dignitaries, the spectacle was even more insidious. A French ambassador might enter the great hall, his silken hose and velvet cloak brushing against dusty banners. By the end of a single audience, his nose and throat would feel raw from inhaling hidden spores. Unaware of the cause, he'd return to his carriage and carriage house with fever and chills, unknowingly transporting Elizabethan mould into foreign territories. Even the Queen herself was not spared. Though she rarely entered her private boudoir without a retinue to hold back the drapes, she sometimes felt a tickle in her bronchi after a long day of council. She coughed once or twice into an ornate silk handkerchief, one that later became stained with copies of her powder and residues of mould spores. That very handkerchief, folded in a pocket, might brush against delicate skin or lace collars, reseeding new colonies upon unsuspecting fabrics. In this way, disgusting hygiene habit number 11, the death trap, furnishings, curtains, carpets and mold, transformed Elizabeth's palace into a silent theatre of affliction. Each thread, each pile of carpet, each swaying drape concealed millions of invisible threats. And as you drift into the hush of night, let the thought of those rich, mold-soaked fabrics linger, a reminder that true opulence can mask the foulest danger, and that the softest velvet can hide the deadliest spores. May your dreams be free of such shadows, and may your waking hours know only fresh air and spotless cloth. Disgusting hygiene. Habit number 12. The chain of contagion from palace to streets. The Queen's rot epidemic did not remain trapped within the gilded walls of Elizabeth I's palace. Instead, it spilled outward, unleashing a terrifying chain of contagion that gripped London's narrow streets and crowded tenements. Servants, guards, craftsmen, and secretaries, each exposed to the Queen or to the palace's fetid air, carried invisible pathogens home with them. Once beyond the royal precincts, they lived in cramped row houses, drawing water from shared wells and trading at bustling markets, where staphylococcus, salmonella, and mold spores found countless new hosts. Any footman or laris returning to their modest lodgings would unload not only their belongings but also the microscopic stowaways that had clung to their garments and skin. That night, as they recounted the day's service to relatives huddled around a single candle, the first signs of illness would emerge: high fevers, piercing chills, abdominal cramps, or painful rashes blossoming across the limbs. In small villages, the first case of horrific diarrhea or a dry, hacking cough often prompted immediate fear. Mothers watched helplessly as weakened infants and frail elders succumbed within days, their immune systems no match for the virulent cocktail imported from Whitehall. Back in London, neighbourhoods closest to the palace recorded a sharp surge in hospital admissions and death certificates. Parish registers, once predictable, now ran crimson with unfamiliar entries: sudden flux, intestinal weakness, strange fever, and malignant cough. The city's charnel houses swelled beyond capacity, and churchyards that had rested in relative peace for years suddenly hosted daily burials of those felled by the silent scourge. To accommodate the dead, clergymen sanctioned mass interments, arranging bodies in contiguous trenches to spare the cost of individual crypts. Local priests dutifully noted these deaths as unnamed pestilence, never daring to implicate the source of the contagion. No formal health alerts sounded, for such notions were centuries away. No one in power would admit that a royal hygiene failure was wreaking havoc among the populace. Instead, whispers spread that Westminster's ghostly airs carried a curse. Vendors abandoned their stalls when the crowds thinned near the palace gates, while travellers from the countryside hesitated before entering London's labyrinthine alleys. In desperation, magistrates in surrounding towns imposed half-hearted quarantine measures. They issued edicts forbidding gatherings in taverns, closing certain markets where palace servants bartered provisions, and halting fairs in neighbouring villages. But enforcement proved lax. Many defied restrictions for the sake of livelihood, smuggling goods, and slipping into prohibited gatherings under cover of darkness. Black market hawkers peddled wares in clandestine alleys, hosting illicit chatter and unwittingly re-spreading the disease. The result was a contagion that no decree could contain. From the grand palace courts to the ramshackle dwellings of the poor, infection leapt unchecked. The richness of the monarchy's image became a grim irony, for the same ceremonies that showcased regal splendour had bred a plague that trembled in every hearth. And even when Elizabeth herself finally passed away, the epidemic's momentum did not cease. The Queen's rot persisted, ghosting through the city's labyrinthine lanes, as factories of death spawned by inadequate hygiene continued their deadly march. This chain of transmission from palace to parish, from grand hall to humble hovel, stands as a stark illustration of the critical importance of public sanitation and sensible isolation. Each newly fallen servant replaced by an eager recruit only perpetuated the cycle, while the absence of disinfection measures, the shared water supplies, and the bustling commerce of markets guaranteed that staphylococcus and salmonella would find fresh victims at every turn. So, as you settle into the stillness of the night, imagine the weary footfall of a returning guard, the hush of a hearthside family dinner, and the hush of an unmarked grave. Let the knowledge of that slow, inexorable spread guide you toward an appreciation of modern public health of quarantines, seamed masks, and sealed sewage systems. In those innovations, we see the hard-won lessons of disgusting hygiene habit number 12. How a single court's neglect rippled outward to imperil an entire city, and how, without vigilance and proper isolation, even the grandest names on history's pages cannot forestall the stealthy advance of disease. May your slumber be untouched by such shadows, and may your dreams rest in safe, clean air. Disgusting hygiene habit number 13. The bedroom curse, the sealed chamber. As Elizabeth I drew her final laboured breath, the Queen's private chamber transformed overnight from sanctified refuge to a place of dread. The moment her spirit departed, an overpowering stench rose from beneath curtains, heavy with centuries of powder, sweat, and stale air. That foul odour, part musty decay, part chemical tang of lead and mercury cosmetics, drifted into the corridors, sickening the guards posted at her door. They complained of pounding headaches and bouts of nausea so fierce that more than one collapsed, retching into the moss-stained stones. Within days, the walls and ceiling of the chamber bloomed with mould the colour of bruises, shades of green, grey and black that crawled across tapestries and wooden beams. The wallpaper peeled away, revealing plaster encrusted with fungal spores as thick as crusty scabs. Despite the best efforts of palace architects, no method of cleaning or purifying could tame the infestation. The damp English air, combined with decades of suppressed hygiene in that hallowed space, had given rise to a microcosm of pathogens that even bright daylight and fresh breeze could not penetrate. Out of desperation, the council resolved to seal the room forever. They ordered the windows shuttered tight, the heavy velvet drapes drawn at every aperture, and the door itself bricked up from floor to arch. Masons laid red brick across the oak lintels, filling every gap with mortar so dense that no breath could pass. They left behind only a small iron grille at the top corner, barely enough to admit minimal air, yet even that opening was soon clogged with dust and spores. Those who laboured on the ceiling project did not escape unscathed. Within a week, several masons reported debilitating coughs, their lungs thick with phlegm. Fevers flared, and one unfortunate foreman succumbed after a fortnight, his body racked by pneumonia so aggressive that it defied every barber surgeon's remedy. Such fatalities led to hushed talk of a deadly curse laid upon the Queen's final resting chamber. Wise women whispered that her restless spirit still prowled the floorboards, punishing any who dared disturb her slumber. Officially, however, the palace blamed malignant airs trapped within the sealed room, insisting that isolation was the only recourse. No cloths soaked in vinegar, no braziers of burning herbs could counteract the stench or sterilize the hidden mould. So the chamber remained entombed. A tomb not just for Elizabeth's body, but for the decades of filth and neglect she had unintentionally nurtured. Over the centuries, as new monarchs succeeded her, no one ventured to pry open that walled-off sanctuary. The palace architects built new wings, redistributing offices and servants' quarters, while the sealed room became a mere footnote in estate records. Its red brick facade, weathered by rain and ivy, blended naturally into the larger structure, hiding the horror within. Yet local lore grew rich with rumours of strange lights and phantom sobs, heard faintly through the stones at midnight. In modern times, archaeologists and historians rediscovered the location of that fabled room. Their exultation at finding a sealed Elizabethan chamber turned quickly to dismay when scans revealed persistent mould spores and traces of toxic heavy metals still lingering inside. Even after centuries of neglect, the spores clung to every surface, wood, plaster, brick, waiting for the slightest crack to release them into the air once more. The tale of the bedroom curse serves as a powerful reminder that not even the greatest political power can triumph over unchecked microbial growth. The Queen's chamber, once a symbol of majesty and grace, became a monument to rot and death, the very antithesis of her public image. In sealing it off, her court admitted defeat before the invisible enemy they had so long overlooked. Tonight, as you lie in your own bed, tucked beneath clean sheets and breathable fabrics, consider the fate of Elizabeth's private refuge. Let the memory of that bricked-up room lull you into a drowsy wonder at how quickly splendour can sour without vigilance. May your dreams enjoy the comfort of fresh air and spotless walls, far from the mould-ridden darkness that claimed the Queen's final chamber, and may you awake with gratitude that your own resting place remains unsealed, unshrouded by curses, and free from the legacy of disgusting hygiene habit number 13. After Elizabeth I's death, the court did everything in its power to erase the traces of what had come to be called the Queen's Rot. The chamber in which she passed away was hastily sealed and forgotten, its stories hushed, until only a few whispered warnings remained. Yet the shadow of that infected room stretched long beyond her lifetime, shaping the way future monarchs and architects approached the palace grounds. In the years immediately following, each successive king or queen refused to set foot where Elizabeth had once slept. They commissioned entirely new suites of rooms, carved alternative corridors through stone walls, and even built grand pavilions farther from the original royal apartments. Maps from the early Stuart period show the original chamber neatly bricked up, then a ribbon of fresh halls looping around it, as if the very stones themselves were radioactive and required avoidance. Courtiers spoke in low voices of that wing and the sealed room, and no one dared question the wisdom of carving out new spaces beyond its malignant reach. By the 18th century, early physicians struggling to explain how disease could arise seemingly from nothing proposed a curious theory, the living corpse hypothesis. They argued that a body left too long in its final resting place could itself become a source of contagion, surcharging the air around with vapors and miasmas that infected all who inhaled them. In medical lectures at nascent universities, Elizabeth's sealed chamber was trotted out as Exhibit A, a royal mausoleum that, despite being empty of living flesh, still reeked of decay and sent waves of illness through each generation of workers and visitors. Though the theory was fundamentally flawed, blaming the cadaver instead of the mold and bacteria, the very fact that learned men invoked her bedroom as a case study reveals how deeply the fear of invisible infection had burrowed into the culture. Meanwhile, the palace continued its ceaseless expansion. Architects added sweeping colonnades, new wings of reception rooms, and separate lodgings for lesser nobility, all meticulously planned to avoid proximity to that accursed chamber. Even in grand gallery spaces, deep within the heart of the complex, no corridor crossed the exact footprint of Elizabeth's final suite. If one studies 18th century surveyors' maps alongside modern satellite imagery, the outline of that sealed room can still be discerned, a ghostly rectangle buried beneath layers of later construction, like a memory fossils in bedrock. Into the 19th and 20th centuries, as the palace gradually opened its doors to curious visitors, tour guides delighted in recounting the legends of the cursed chamber. They would lower their voices near the spot marked on the guidebook, advising attentive guests to keep their distance. Some claimed that on chilly mornings, a faint greenish vapor might curl beneath the floorboards, though no sensitive instrument could confirm such sightings. In these anecdotes, the old fear of miasma found new life as ghost story, stitched into the tapestry of royal folklore. The persistence of these beliefs underscores a profound truth. Germs and viruses remain invisible, yet their effects are woven indelibly into our architecture, our maps, and our shared stories. The walled-up room in Elizabeth's palace was itself an early monument to the power of infection. Though the living corpse theory would later be debunked by pioneers of germ theory and aseptic technique, the act of sealing the chamber, a crude form of quarantine, anticipated the public health measures that would emerge centuries later. Today, visitors strolling the manicured gardens or admiring the ornate staterooms hear only a faint echo of the old whispers. Yet the very design of the palace, its segmented corridors, its detached wings, its forbidding brick barrier still bears the imprint of that original chain of fear and disease. Modern tours may steer clear of the precise location where Elizabeth's bedroom once lay, but they cannot wholly avoid the resonance of centuries of caution and superstition. For every carved cornice and vaulted ceiling, there remains a silent testament to the horror that can dwell behind the grandest facades. And so the tale of that sealed room serves as more than a footnote in royal biographies. It reminds us how deeply the spectre of contagion shapes our built environment and our legends. Invisible viruses and bacteria may travel unseen through the air, yet they leave marks that endure in stone and brick, in deed polls and guidebooks, and in the very architecture of fear. As you close your eyes, drifting toward dreams, imagine those once sealed walls still holding within them the memory of mold and decay, and know that, though time may pass, the shadow of disease can never be fully exorcised from the places we hold most sacred. And so, as we draw the drapes softly across the corridor of memory and let the echoes of that sealed chamber recede into the stillness, It is time to slow our hearts and let the last murmurings of the past drift gently away. There is nothing here but the quiet reassurance that, though shadows may linger in history's corners, we carry forward the light of understanding and compassion. From the forgotten Queen's Rot to the whispered legends of sealed bedrooms, we learn that the smallest acts of care, of cleanliness, of kindness, can ripple outward in ways both grand and subtle. Tonight, let us leave behind the rustle of velvet drapes and the hush of hidden mold spores. Replace them in your mind with the soft sigh of a breeze through an open window, the tender warmth of clean sheets, and the gentle rhythm of your own breathing. These are the true monuments to health and hope, built not of brick and mortar, but of simple vigilance and human compassion. In every folded sheet, in every hand-washed dish, and in every tender embrace, we weave a protection far stronger than any curse or contagion. Remember always that knowledge is our finest safeguard, and empathy our greatest balm. As you close your eyes, think not of the darkness that once lay behind bricked-up doors, but of the bright dawn that follows each night. Think of how, in homes around the world, people have learned to wash away fear with soap, to replace superstition with science, and to turn whispered legends into opportunities for connection and care. And if ever you feel the chill of old tales brush against your mind, recall the promise of today, that by understanding our past, we protect our future, that by honoring the dignity of every life, no matter how humble the station, or how fleeting the moment, we build a world where no room remains sealed by neglect or superstition. Let gratitude fill your thoughts, for fresh air, for the safety of your own bed, and for the hands that prepared it. Now, as the last candle gutter fades into darkness, let my voice become a soft murmur at the edge of your dreams. May you rest in comfort, safe from every imagined shadow, and awaken renewed, ready to greet the morning with a heart full of hope. Good night, dear friends. May your slumber be deep and undisturbed. And if you have found comfort or curiosity in this tale, please subscribe to our channel so that more gentle stories and hidden histories may find their way to you. Sleep well, and until we meet again, sweet dreams.